Thank you. Thank you, John, for your thoughtful reflections and the lessons derived from your empirical work. Dewey reminded us that the practice of democratic citizenship is renewed in classrooms, in societies, each generation. There is nothing given about the fragile edifice we call the practice of democratic citizenship. It was the other man, Thomas Mann, that in his lectures, the BBC lectures he gave from the west side of LA when he was in exile in the Pacific Palisades, that reminded us that the condition of democracy cannot be taken as granted. And of course, Horace Mann, a very important person in the history of Latin American public education, Horace Mann, Mary Mann, and Sarmiento were in fundamental ways the architects of free public education in Argentina, and this created echoes all over Latin America that are so significant and so important. And Mann and Sarmiento saw the work of education as fundamental for the sensibilities that are required for the practice of democratic citizenship in the formative moment in public education. And today, we see throughout the world a need to reanimate the promise of education and its fundamental role in democracy. Thank you so much. We have time for time now for discussions, for questions for Professor Sachs and Professor Rogers. Vittorio, Ratika, Maurice, I'm going to write this down because jet lag is interfering with the central nervous system function. Sebastian will remind us tomorrow. So, Vittorio, Ratika, Maurice, Bill.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you. Is it on? Or? Thank you very much. And first of all, I want to thank you, Jeff, very much for your tireless work for this very noble goal. It's absolutely due to basic rights that we owe to people. However, I have one question to you and one question to you. The first question is, philosophers, I'm a philosopher, not an economist or a pedagogist, have often discussed what rights mean. And the traditional understanding is that the concept of right, distinguished from the concept of morally desirable, entails that there is a legal duty. If I have a right to a certain thing, others have a duty either to respect, for example, my property, or even to do positive things. And the big problems of the list of rights in the conventions that you quoted, the Human Declaration is not binding according to international law, is that it is not clear who has the corresponding duties. And it is certainly natural to say that the people who are closer have a stronger duty. So my question is, do you also try to convince governments that in order to do what is absolutely right with regard to their own population, they should reduce military spending. They should reduce inefficient bureaucracies. Of course, they cannot involve all the budget in education, but they could try to reduce it. Second, I was impressed that in your calculations you started from class size of 25, certainly desirable. I may mention I was educated up to the 7th grade in Germany, which was at that time one of the richest countries of the world, always in classes over 40 children. That was my education, and it was not too bad, if I may say so. The second question is concerning the concept of democracy. I completely agree with you that democracy is not simply on the paper, but it must be trained by constant living the values. But one point that worries me in the actual debates is philosophers, again, have sharply distinguished between the principle of liberalism, which is based on the idea that each individual has certain rights, which can best be protected by a complex system of separation of powers, and the principle of democracy that is based on the will of a majority. And I myself have always been a defender of the idea that the two principles are logically compatible. You can devise a system like the American Constitution in which you have both principles, but if you have to choose between the two, liberalism is a far, far better defense of what we all want than democracy. And the central argument is Carl Schmitt, who developed in his Verfassungslehre principles, famously said in 1933, we are now living through the triumph of democracy over liberalism, because now the majority can do whatever we want. And my question to you is, are you sensibilizing in your project the students to a complex understanding that it is democratic if, for example, judges decide against what the majority wants, that this is reasonable and good, and only such a form of democracy can really guarantee basic rights?
Thank you, Vittorio. I think we should take a few questions. Jeff and John, how do you prefer to proceed? Do you want me to take up various comments, or do you want to respond to each?
Maybe to respond to this.
Okay.
Formally, the definition of human rights in our global diplomacy is defined by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this is an agreement of all governments that says that the General Assembly proclaims this Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, to the end that every individual and every organ of society, keeping this declaration constantly in mind, shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for these rights and freedoms, and by progressive measures, national and international, to secure their universal and effective recognition and observance. So it is it's a compact of the United Nations. And I think that it is not international law as international lawyers would understand it, but it is also not a mere nicety. It is a solemnly agreed universal set of standards that has been repeated, as I pointed out, generation after generation, including most recently on September 25th, 2015, in the presence of Pope Francis, who opened calling for a common plan for the planet, and by acclamation, the governments adopted the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. I also think from a natural rights perspective, I would argue that these are economic and human rights from the tradition of natural law, because Article 1 says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And I think it's notable, by the way, that in the very line of the Church, dignity comes before rights in the Universal Declaration. This is made clear many times. This is about human dignity, and I think that that is a fundamental consideration as well. In terms of the practical financing, just 2 points. One, if we take your standard of 40 students rather than 25, it comes to 15% of GDP rather than 20% of GDP. Still far beyond anything that is imaginable. So practically speaking, I don't want to hold us to one particular number, but I'm making a more general point. That is irrespective of whether the country is doing everything possible. It cannot keep all the children in school. It requires global collaboration and partnership in order to do that. That's the most basic point to keep in mind. I spend a lot of my time urging governments everywhere to raise their tax revenues and to stop their military spending, just to be sure. And in any practical approach, like the one that I helped to develop 20 years ago, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, when a government applies for funding to the Global Fund, it has to show its own effort. This is absolutely essential. This is not a free ride at all. I want to bring the IMF in because the IMF will say, you are wasting this and this and this. You need to raise more revenues. But then there will be a gap that is absolutely unclosable on their own. And that's where we have to come in. And that's the logic of this, that the effort has to start domestically in a maximal way. We should understand, by the way, that the international tax system is rigged by the powerful countries to make it very difficult for poor countries to collect tax revenues. Because where would they collect tax revenues? From the companies of the rich countries. And that, by Mr. Trump and by a tradition that dates back 50 years, is by design set up for evasion. So this is not something that is just at the hands of the low-income countries. I like to say that it's true, there is corruption everywhere, not just in Washington. We need to fight it everywhere, but the biggest corruption is in Washington, not surprisingly, because if you look where the real billions are lost, it's in the rich countries that run the system, not in the poor countries. Poor people without the US hedge funds, the investment banks, and the tax havens couldn't even steal. We provide the technology for the grand theft. Be sure of it. There's no poor country system for theft on a scale of billions. If you look at who is actually doing it, it is my neighbors down the block on Wall Street that are literally the ones that are enabling the grand larceny. So even if there's corruption in these countries, they don't have the mechanics to do it. They need the big boys. And that's where the real theft is.
John, you want to respond?
Let me begin by trying to bridge between the two questions. I'm struck by the many studies that have been done about youth organizing and youth activism around the world, that some of the most powerful youth activism is activism in which young people come together to try to enact and realize the full possibilities of a high-quality education as a fundamental right. We've seen this in South Africa. In New York, young people played a huge role in political and legal efforts to try to raise the amount and equalize the amount of funding. And so rights and democratic mobilization in that sense have an interactive effect. On your interesting question about liberalism and democracy, let me go back to Dewey, who pushed against this idea that democracy in a narrow sense was about majoritarian rule. For Dewey, this notion of democracy as a way of life suggested that we need to foreground communication in a way that wasn't simply assuming that both parties to communication were going to remain the same and hold the same interests after the fact, but rather that communication becomes a way in which we transform one another. So for Dewey, as he says, there's more than a verbal connection between communication and community. Communication becomes a way to create new forms of social interaction, which I think also is a response to how schools can address the intolerance and hostility. We create, through meaningful communication, new forms of social interaction in the process.
Thank you so much. I have 5 questions. Monsignor, Rathika, Maurice, Bill, and Pierre. Monsignor.
It is clear that our lower philosopher Aristotle said that education is the more important thing that you can do as human to transmit the humanity to the knowledge of the humanity to the new generation in the politics. So, but we speak about the global world. And what is the system of education in China? Because we have here two empires, to say the truth. America, that is in a position that, as I say, that I heard about Jeff, the situation tragic, and China, that is a new, of course, have many problems, and the virus and other things, but anyway, have a new position in the world. And also all the other countries to depend of China, Asia and all the, and what is the position of China about this? Because it could be very important. It's a not democratic country, we know. And, but you know, Jeff, something about this?
China, of course, has universal education, and it has, by recent accounts, very high results, but selected because we have the results for Shanghai and for Beijing and for Tianjin, I believe, and a few other major centers, and they rank at the top of the so-called PISA scores, which are the international comparative scores. So there seems to be strong educational performance in the basic skills, math, science, reading. That is what we know. I think in terms of many of these other issues, I doubt that they're in the curriculum right now, some of the issues about global citizenship and so forth. But I think that there is an openness to discussion on this point with China, because there's a mobilization for knowledge in China now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If I may add, China, through education, moved 1 billion people out of deep poverty and into another very different standard of living. I concur with Jeff. The only thing I would add is that there is a concern in China today on matters relating to originality, creativity, the qualities, the je ne sais quoi of education that can't be easily captured by PISA and by such standardized tests. So Ratika, and then Maurice and Bill.
Thank you. My question is regarding why education has not been able to meet its goals. The two aspects the two speakers mentioned were funding and democracy. And maybe there's another factor which has not come up in the discussion. I just want to narrate a short story. A couple of years back, I worked in a slum community in Delhi. Elections were coming up, and the schools were in bad condition. Windows broken, there was water everywhere, bathrooms were not functional, a lot of other functional issues in the school. So I spoke to the local government officer. He was supposed to again be re-elected. He's a elected personnel. He was standing up for elections again. I asked him, sir, the schools are in bad condition. Can you come over to the school so that the government, you will show support to the schools and the Department of Education will maybe get more mobilized and will become more motivated. And he turned back and said, Madam, sorry, I can't come to the schools because the children don't vote for me. I need to go where the votes are. So my question here is, how can we make education a political agenda? At least in India, when elections are run, education is a non-issue. So can we make some mobilization of elected representatives who can make education a political agenda?
Thank you. Maurice, Bill, Pierre. Let's take all the questions, and then we'll give Jeff and John an opportunity to respond.
First of all, thank you for both.
Microphone.
Yep, thank you. But my question is for you, John. So I think it's very important the work you're doing, the research in schools, and how basically the rhetoric from politics is entering into schools. And there's a lot of work done in Europe that goes to the same sort of conclusions as you've shown. But I think we also need to understand a more deeper level here. I think, and this comes out of research I'm doing at the moment in Europe among native white people living in majority-minority neighborhoods. And I think one of the conclusions of that research is that, at least in Europe, for 40 years, our intention has been on migrants, migrant children, grandchildren. We developed diversity policies to include them, but we totally forgot the native white people in this story. So what is their identity in this diverse setting? So, and what is their voice? And we left it to the right-wing politicians to make clear what their voice is and what their identity is. So we really need to address these native white kids. What sort of identity can we really provide for them in these ethnically diverse settings that they live in? And if we don't answer that question, we will not have a debate in schools. And I think that's something we need to address.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bill.
Thank you. Thank you for both excellent talks. I have a question for each of them. On Professor Sachs's talk, I was very pleased at your reference to the Universal Declaration. One of the things that Eleanor Roosevelt and her committee made a point to do was to frame each of the articles in ways that both communicated universal moral principles and also left open the ways that these would be interpreted and applied across all of the different world's cultures. And so there was some flexibility in what each of them meant, but a strong position that each of these were universally universal expectations for establishing human dignity. And I wondered if you see, I thought that, to me, this is a fine model for a global pact on education, which again, education all over the world is going to look different in different schools, different economic needs, different kinds of backgrounds, and whether there should be that's the vision that there should be these universal principles set in a context of cultural differences. So that was the issue on Professor Sachs's talk. On Professor Rogers' talk, I think there's an open question left open, which is about, and I thought it was very important, the norm of civility. I think he's correctly identified as essential. Civility, children are not born into the world learning how to solve conflicts in a civil manner. It is something that they need to learn, and they learn it through education. And the question is what the role of the adult authority is in that. Each of the examples that Professor Rogers gives in his paper has the teacher or some adult authority eventually coming in and imposing the norm of civility to get the problem solved. At least that's the way I read the examples. And yet in the paper there's an open question and the Dewey vision that children maybe could learn this spontaneously or do this spontaneously. And my question really is this a role for a moral authority to say if this is not being developed or if it's not being discovered, civility, through spontaneous play or interactions, is it not the role of the teacher or the adult to say, in our setting, in our school, and in our society, we expect civility. This is a universal norm that we think is important for all children, and just like learning mathematics, we don't have you, if you discover that 2 and 2 equals 5, at some point the teacher corrects it. So should there be a moral authority in the developmental process of children, or educating for civility?
Thank you so much. Professor Pierre Lénat.
This is a comment, maybe a question too, to the beautiful presentation by John Rogers. It also connects with 2 comments made in the previous session by Marcelo Suarez and our Chancellor on the role of science. And the difference in many of those school discussions, I've been involved in that since a quarter of a century now for science education, often the issue comes to make a difference between an opinion, which is being discussed in the classroom, and an evidence, and a scientific evidence, which is not to be discussed. It's there, it's the reality. And of course, science education aims at making to the students and to the teachers, of course, this difference, which is a very fundamental difference, because the recognition of facts and evidence is universal. I mean, wherever you are, the Earth is not flat, it's a sphere, etc. So the difficulty there, and maybe that's a question for Jeff, is that science education is even in a poorest state worldwide than is education in general. Why? Because teachers are not so well paid. They are essentially ignorant. I have many experience in the last years of training teachers in Africa, Asia on climate education. They know nothing, period, not even the rations of that. So we have this challenge, and I'd like to hear your comments on those, or both of you on that.
Thank you, Pierre. Jeff and John.
I would suggest that our process in advising Pope Francis look carefully at the various commitments that have been made over the last 72 years, to understand them and to see how to best incorporate them, because to the extent that these are already universal goals, they give, of course, a great added lift to what we're trying to do. If you go back to the Universal Declaration, it says 3 things. 1, that every child has a right to education. 2nd, that education should include the full development of the human personality and the strengthening of respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, understanding, tolerance, friendship among nations. That idea has remained throughout all of the documents. So teaching for global citizenship is a continuing idea. And then the 3rd clause is parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. That's in the Universal Declaration. The idea of choice and local choice is clearly part of any realistic approach. I don't think that this that there's any doubt of that. But it would be very useful, I think, to put the Pope's effort on May 14 into a historic and global context, because it is the added impetus, and it's the touchstone for all the other parts of the world. And currently, SDG 4 is our generation's version of this continuing commitment and determination. SDG 4 adds education for sustainable development. So it's quite explicit about that. That wasn't there before. Now, how can this be done? Teachers are not trained, so we need to develop a curriculum. This is what Ramanathan was talking about earlier. We need to develop online materials that are available for training of teachers and for direct access of students. And I think that this should be part of the agenda.
I'll take up each of these questions very briefly. I think that this question of can we make education more politically salient is really important. I would add that we want to think about making it politically salient in the appropriate ways. So if education is played out in the United States becomes politically salient in ways that establish education more as a marketplace than as a public good, that's a problematic move. I think the extent to which we can engage young people in the process of thinking about their own agency relative to the quality of their education, that refocuses attention on education as a public good. I really appreciated this point about the disaffection of white youth who don't find a space, and it made me think about John Powell's work around belongingness. And I think he offers a way to reconceptualize some of these ideas of civility in a manner that addresses some of that sense of disaffection. I don't think it's a coincidence that in some of the same communities that I studied where some of the most overt acts of racism were playing out, you also saw incredible difficulties with opioid addiction. And that I think was playing out in part as a result of that economic distress and sense of lack of cultural understanding. The question about science education, I think it's important to think about science education and science as a verb, as a process. And I'm sitting next to the founder of the Reggio schools. To the extent to which young people can become empowered in relationship to the process of inquiring into knowledge, repositions science education in more powerful ways that I think are responsive to fake news. And then finally, very quickly, in response to Professor Damon's important question about authority, I would suggest that following Dewey, we think about authority is embedded within activities in which young people can look to other youth as well as adults as guideposts for how they behave.
Thank you so much. A wonderful, wonderful set of presentations, a wonderful morning. I am grateful. You have earned your lunch. A comer, al pranzo. We gather here back at 2 o'clock sharp. Thank you.